Hey, I'm talking today with Phil Williams. How you doing, Phil?
Hey Jim, how are you?
Pretty good. We're talking about your favorite thriller, and so the book that we were going to talk about today, that you said you want to talk about, is Descent by Tim Johnston. Can you give us like a little synopsis or a spoiler-free teaser about this book?
Sure. The family their last name, the Cortlands. They take this summer vacation to the Rocky Mountains, and their daughter, Caitlin, she's this very talented high school runner, and she takes off in the morning. She wants to run in the mountains of the Rockies, basically, to help with I guess for the altitude. It'll help her running in her lungs. So she goes out for her early morning run. She takes her younger brother Sean along. Now her younger brother's kind of this in the beginning of the book. He's kind of this out of shape, younger teen. He's kind of a little bit awkward, and so he takes his bike, and she sort of, halfway makes him go. He doesn't really want to go, but he goes along. And the inciting incident is Caitlin ends up disappearing, and the rest of the novel focuses on a good chunk of the novel focuses on the family and how they're dealing with the tragedy and how they're searching for Caitlin. And the story, it's written with just such an incredible realism and emotion. You feel like you're in the Rockies. You feel like you're going through that pain of I can't even imagine. I mean, going through the pain of losing a child, but that I think you get a good feeling for the pain that the family goes through. And throughout the book, what really pulls you forward is that drive to find out what happened.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that it's more of a character-based story or a plot-based story?
Definitely more character based. The plot, in my opinion, the plot's well done, but what makes the book special is the character development. The family, they all, and this I think is really realistic, is each family member, they all react very differently to the tragedy. In some ways they grow as people, but in other ways they fall apart. And in some ways their relationships are strengthened, and in other ways they are pulled apart. And their grief and the relationships that they have with each other, it's just very tragic and very believable.
Hmm. Interesting. So, can you tell us about the villain in the story without spoiling anything, or is revealing the villain a spoiler for the book?
No, I can talk a little bit about it without giving a identity. So the I'm trying to think. What's interesting about the villain is, and this probably goes against what you'll find in most books, is you have no contact with the villain for the majority of the book. You just know she's gone. Like you have no idea what happened to her. And that's, in my opinion, it's kind of terrifying because you literally she's just evaporated. I mean, it's and there's very you start to get some of the villain's point of view towards the end of the book, and then you start to see who the villain is, and it's and that in of itself is realistic and terrifying. But a good chunk of the book you don't even know. You have and that really and that in my opinion that really helped to turn the pages to find these things out. But I think that the good thing about a great villain, and I think this story does it well, is that even though you don't really find out a lot about him towards the end, you do find out a good chunk about him, and to me he's believable. He's not this you know arch villain like you would find in a Marvel comic book. I mean, he's somebody that you might pass by on the street one day, and you wouldn't even know. You would have no idea that he's got some girl locked up someplace. And I think that in of itself is terrifying.
Yeah, I've always found it much more convincing and compelling in a book when that the monster around the corner is a lot less terrifying than not knowing what's around the corner. That idea of approaching a corner and you
Right.
don't know what's there is a lot scarier than not knowing, or it's a lot scarier than knowing there is a monster around the corner or seeing the monster. That
Right.
that sense of that sense of dread is really what propels, I think, me through a lot of books. Um,
Right. The suspense too, right?
yeah.
It's just that, yeah.
So speaking of villains, how important do you think a great villain is to a thriller book?
I think it's very important. I think what I think is interesting is I think most people, and I think this is in life in general. I think most people view themselves as the hero in their life. Pretty much everybody, even people that are total a-holes, they think that they're the hero in their life for the most part. And I think a good villain is like that. Like they don't think of themselves as, hey, I'm a bad guy, like or girl. You know, I have some female antagonists in my books, but they think of themselves as, even when they're doing something awful, they have a reason that makes sense to them, even if it's deranged. But I think, and I think a good thriller villain is like that, where they actually think of themselves as the hero, not the actual villain. And I think that they also have to have, like, they can't just be this person that's totally, I mean, they can, but I think it makes more sense when they actually have people that support them. When they have friends, they have family, they have people that think that they're great, even when they're not. And I think that having a villain that's well-rounded and actually has a point of view, I think is huge for a thriller novel.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you usually don't see that in a lot of thriller novels, to be honest with you. A lot of times you see the guy that's just this deranged person that's totally by themselves.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to make that deranged person convincing and interesting if they don't have that additional depth of maybe caring for something or believing that their cause is a worthy cause.
Right.
So would you describe Descent as a page turner, and what does that mean? What does it mean when a book is a page turner to you?
Yeah, so page turner, and I think I'm to the point now where I only read page turners, because if I get to the point where I'm not turning the pages, it's just like, yeah, I'm done with this. So for me, a page turner can be anything from nonfiction to fiction, you name it. And what's interesting about Descent is it shouldn't be a page turner. It's a very long book. It's a dense book. It's heavy on descriptions. It's almost, I would say it would be like a literary thriller. And I'll read some literary fiction, but I'm not a huge, like, if it's a plotting type book, I'll put it down. But the descriptions were so well done, and the detailed presentation of the minutia of the scenes was such a pleasure to read, and the way the sentences were constructed. I mean, it was just really, really well constructed, and it ended up being a page turner, despite the fact that it was a slow paced book, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And it was just, to me, when I say slow paced, it was paced perfectly, but if you look at actually what actually happened, it's a long book. Like, that could have been chopped in half, but the scenes were set up and described so well that it was just such a pleasure to read it, and I wouldn't chop a single word off of it.
Is it part of a series?
No, it's a standalone.
Could you tell us if it would work as a series, or if it would spoil something? You don't have to answer that question.
I definitely think it would not work as a series. I mean, everything is pretty well resolved at the end, and I don't see how you would. I mean, I guess you could try to fit something together, but I think it wouldn't be near as good as the original if you tried to throw something else at these people. I think I think that what they went through was enough.
Yeah,
it's enough for them.
Yeah. So you talked about how that has very vivid descriptions. Is that the thing that makes it stand? Or what is the thing that makes it stand above other thrillers you've read to make it your favorite thriller?
Definitely the character development. That's a big part of it. And then obviously the beautiful prose. I mean, you just don't see that very often in thriller novels, where somebody really put the time to really make the writing poetic. I think he did a really fantastic job of that.
Yeah, that's hard in a thriller, because usually in a thriller you want to keep people moving from page to page to page as quickly as possible, and so you don't normally want to take the time to slow down to describe how the sunlight reflected off the seashell on the beach.
Right.
But you have to be a very skilled writer to be able to do that and maintain the sense of upbeat pace required for a thriller, right?
Exactly. And I think he did. Now, granted, I mean, you read the reviews, you'll have some people disagree, but I was captivated.
Have you read anything else by Tim Johnston?
When I read Descent, that was his first published novel, I believe. He had nothing else, and since then he wrote a children's novel called Never So Green, and that book is actually on my Kindle right now. I haven't read that yet, and he has a new thriller that just came out in January. I have plans to read that too, but Never So Green is a kid's. It's like I think it's even younger than young adult, so middle grade. But it looked interesting. The reason I put it on my Kindle was when I was going through these questions, and I'm like, you know what? I haven't looked up Tim Johnston's page in a long time, because after I read Descent, I was like, well, I'm interested in reading more, but he didn't have anything else at the time, which is I guess it's a lesson for authors. You try to have other books, but and then when I went back and checked, he's got the kids book, and then he's got the other one is what's the thriller? I forget the name of it. That one actually I forget the name of it, but one that came out in January, and that one actually has worse reviews than Descent. I mean, I think it's like rated at 3.5 on Amazon, but I'll definitely give that one a try.
So here's a kind of general question as we're drawing to a close. What is it that makes a thriller a thriller?
That's a good question. I think that a thriller is going to be any book, technically any book that thrills, right? But what it is that creates the thrills, I think it doesn't really matter in my opinion. It could be a murder, or it could be an extramarital affair, or it could be a sporting event. And I think that if you can thrill the reader, get them to keep turning the pages, regardless of what the event is. Obviously, the common one is the murder mystery type. That's usually the common thriller. There's murder and mayhem, but I've read some really good thrillers that have no murders. So I think that if you can create that suspense and make the reader, feel what the characters are feeling and feel that danger or feel those that elation, I think you've got a good thriller.
Mm-hmm. Great. So what book of yours would you like to talk about today for our listeners to know about?
I guess my second most recent thriller, which is The Predator Hunter. It's about a 20-something landscaper that catfishes pedophiles on the internet. So he catfishes these pedophiles, meets them in person, and then confronts them with his camera with the intention of exposing their identity and ruining their lives, essentially. So this, of course, gets very dangerous as these men are desperate to keep their secrets, and he finds interesting people that are on the other end of these profiles. And of course, he finds the danger and the suspense along the way.
Oh, that sounds interesting. That's The Predator Hunter by Phil M. Williams. All right, Phil, is there anything else you want to talk about? Anything you want the listeners and the viewers to know about before we go?
Not that I can think of. I guess one thing I would mention is if you go to philwbooks.com, you can get a copy of Against the Grain for free if you're interested in signing up to my email list. And of course, obviously, you can unsubscribe anytime. But a lot of whenever I have a sale or anything, my readers get notified, and I only send out a couple emails a month. So I try not to spam readers and try to write some interesting stuff to keep people reading the emails. So it's not just about the books, but I do try to write some interesting things every twice a month. So.
Well, great. Thanks for hanging out with me today. The book that Phil talked about was The Descent by Tim Johnston, and his own book is The Predator Hunter. All right. Thanks for hanging out with me today, Phil.
Great. Thanks, Jim.